Welcome everyone to today's Dart Center conversation, June 11th, 2020. This is the latest in an ongoing series of conversations for journalists, which started as a response to the COVID-19 crisis and which we're now, I think, repurposing as a permanent feature of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma's ongoing work. For those of you who are new to this conversation, I am Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of Columbia Journalism School in New York City. We are a global ideal lab, resource center, training program for journalists covering violence, crisis, and tragedy in all dimensions and all over the world. We are here at the peak of an extraordinary couple of weeks, both in the United States and around the world, in which the murder of George Floyd, captured on video by a courageous 17-year-old young woman, has transformed this country's conversation about criminal justice, transformed the global conversation about historic racism. It's also pushed to the forefront some very important questions for journalists: whose stories we tell and why, how we tell them. We're going to focus today on investigative reporting at the intersection of race and criminal justice. What hasn't been working, what is working, what we can do better. Very lucky to have to lead us through this terrain my colleague Mark Rochester, who is the the editor-in-chief of Type Investigations, the one of the nonprofit investigative journalism centers reshaping American journalism. An outfit he just joined a couple of months ago. Before that, he was the multi-award winning and quite distinguished investigative editor of the Detroit Free Press and had a long career in American journalism after that. Mark, good to have you here.
Thank you. Good morning.
The way these conversations go, Mark and I will talk for the first half hour or so, and then we'll go to all of you, colleagues in the room, for questions, which we will take over the chat just to avoid issues of bandwidth and voice crossovers and all those usual things that plague Zoom conversations. If questions occur to you in the chat, just throw them into the chat while we're talking, or then once we turn it over, you can really kind of begin to move in an aggressive way. Also, I should note that my colleague Susan Kaplan, Dart Center Rockberg Fellow, is in the Zoom room taking notes for an ongoing series of Dart Center tip sheets, which we are generating off the back of these conversations. Mark, let's start here. When you and I spoke the other day, the first question out of your mouth, first thing, and I said, so what should we talk about? You said, you know, we really need to talk about why journalism has failed to do more to document and to investigate police violence. And that resonated with me because for all of the power of this moment, it was instigated not by a journalist, but by a citizen with a video camera. Say a little more about what you mean and why you think we need to have this conversation.
I don't think it's any coincidence that you haven't seen a lot of aggressive coverage from the industry as a whole for the last couple of decades. And I think that's because, you know, newsrooms in general are run by, you know, sort of middle-aged white men who don't have this shared experience that a lot of journalists of color have in terms of not necessarily personal interactions with police, but communities of color often have more interactions with police than other journalists. And so for a lot of newsroom managers, this isn't a top of mind issue. It's something that, you know, gets attention when there's some kind of incident like we've seen, you know, recently, when there's a shooting, when there's some kind of misconduct allegation. something that draws the attention of reporters and editors that, hey, maybe we should start looking at police, when it probably should have been on our minds collectively for a much longer period of time, and we should have been asking more questions all along. I think when, I'm gonna reveal my age now, but I was born into segregation. People think that segregation was just something that happened in the South. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, the birthplace of the Klan. When I was born, and as a young child, there were movie theaters I couldn't go to. I couldn't go to amusement parks. Um, and growing up as a child, I heard all exactly the same kinds of advice that Black fathers are still giving their children today. You have to be careful when if you ever have an interaction with the police, you have to be careful what you say and do. Here, I could rattle off a litany of young Black men who were shot by police in Indianapolis just as I was growing up. It's a city with a terrible history of police misconduct and that sort of thing. So those kinds of experiences are in the minds of a lot of African American journalists, a lot of African American citizens in general, and so I think that's that kind of background is probably more natural to me. I'm not background, but that kind of thinking about police misconduct being on my radar is probably more common to someone like me than it is other newsroom managers.
We'll get in a few minutes to questions of specific areas to scrutinize, methodologies, but I think this fundamental question of whose stories get told and how we create a newsroom agenda around race and criminal justice and around other issues that reflect the perceptions of communities of color is a big question. I think you have a few PowerPoints that you wanted to show as a way of getting us into that conversation. You want to take us where we need to go?
Bear with me 1 second.
We are doing the screen share thing. It will be with you in a minute. There he goes.
So one of the reasons I mentioned sort of, newsrooms are a reflection of the priorities of their top managers. What you're looking at now is just a few images from my previous newsroom, the Detroit Free Press. One of the things I'm very proud of is the work my investigative team did at the Free Press, not just the individual investigations that we did, but the kinds of stories we focused on. There are several newspapers in Detroit. It's one of the few cities that still has multiple print options for readers. And the Free Press looked very different from other media in town because we went after stories that a lot of newsrooms just don't do anymore. And so the kind of stories you're seeing now, as you can see, a couple of them are in fact about police misconduct. And these stories start from the earliest days of my time at the Free Press. This is something that I had reporters, a diverse group of reporters who cared about these issues, were eager to look at these issues, and that's the kind of work that we did. The same is true. I've been at Type Investigations for 2 months now. I've never actually seen my office, but we've been involved in this kind of work, since before I got there, and we're trying to continue that work after my arrival. And so, as you can see from some of the stories here, this is very much our mindset as well. We want to do the stories that other media aren't pursuing. We tend to do them in partnership with other newsrooms. This story on the left here, for example, is a story we did with the Huffington Post. We just had a story that appeared in the New York Times, Sunday Magazine. So our newsroom model attempts to do stories in partnership with other outlets, different multimedia storytelling with a variety of outfits.
But it sounds like one of the things you're simply saying is, okay, let's take the intersection of race and criminal justice as an important issue, and then ask, what are the stories no one else is doing? Instead of trying to kind of, as we so often, our default position of journalists sometimes is to do variations on a theme, to seize on stories that are clearly getting attention, issues that everybody's talking about, and advance the story, which is one way of working. You're suggesting, where is no one else looking right now? What's a little piece of terrain that's worth asking a question about? Here you are, preterm births in Detroit. There's
Yeah,
all kinds of
absolutely.
reporting on healthcare, but looking at preterm births as a marker of a community's public health system, that's a
Right.
kind of fresh approach. And it does collide, in that case, with race and healthcare.
Exactly. And in this case, the reason I went backward, the preterm birth story is an outgrowth of this story that we're looking at right now. This is an investigation into the mayor of Detroit and a conflict of interest investigation that we did, where it turns out the mayor has, or may still have, a mistress, this woman at the top of the page. That wasn't our interest in this story. It turned out that the mayor of Detroit set up this woman with a high-profile nonprofit job where city funds and other city resources were directed to this nonprofit organization whose mission was to battle preterm births in the city of Detroit. So hundreds of thousands of dollars were directed to this nonprofit that he basically placed her in. And one of the issues we wanted to look at was, well, are they doing any, this is basically a no bid contract situation. So one of the things we wanted to look at was, well, is in fact this nonprofit doing what they claim it's doing? And so we wanted to look at, well, what's happened to preterm births since this organization came into existence? And we discovered that preterm births actually went dramatically up, as opposed to their claims that they were actually making a dent in preterm births. Again, this wasn't an issue that, probably wouldn't have been on the radar of anyone else but the free press. These are, Detroit is 80% Black. And so the issue of preterm births is not something you see very often in other media coverage, but we know this is a serious issue in Detroit for a lot of, healthy babies is something that is very much on the mind of families in Detroit. So we thought this is an important issue to bring up, that if we're going to spend money to try and combat this problem, it should be spent in a thoughtful, effective way.
Yeah.
One of the things I think we wanted to talk about, Bruce, was you can't just sort of parachute in this issue of police misconduct now and really hope to convince readers that this is something we're exploring, on your behalf, readers, because we know this is an issue that impacts the community. At the Free Press, we were always interested in this issue. So here's a number of stories that we did, as I said, from early on in my tenure there. And these were not popular stories with readers. A lot of readers take issue, or did take issue before the last couple of months, with any suggestion that stories about bad cops were worth a newspaper pursuing, because, oh, you're just looking at a few bad apples. You're making disparaging statements about all police, when it's only, this only happens once in a blue moon. And
that brings up an issue that I think more editors need to remember when dealing with seemingly unpopular issues, like, well, who cares about police misconduct? It looks to all the world as if this moment, the George Floyd moment and the George Floyd movement, happened out of nowhere, came out of nowhere. There's a video, it goes viral. It's one of the worst things I've ever looked at in the policing documentation world, but it sparks outrage around the world, and it does. But the reality is that there's a steady, you never know which video or which story is going to be the one. And behind it, there's an accumulation often of years of investigative reporters chipping away, of advocates and activists chipping away. So something I think editors need to remember is that you're always laying the foundation for the next big story on criminal justice reform, kind of regardless of what your readers may think at a particular moment. You need to have a long-term vision of keeping this issue on the public radar.
Exactly.
So it's strategic. It's not just story by story. It's a strategic focus on race and criminal justice.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I stress in my current work with Type, as well as the work I did at the Free Press, was, these aren't stories about numbers or a rising trend of police shootings or anything like that. These are always stories about people. And so we had a very dramatic incident in Detroit where Michigan State Police chased a 15-year-old kid on an ATV while the ATV was still moving at like 30, 40 miles an hour. They tased him. And so he crashed into the back of the pickup truck you see here and died. We wanted to know everything we could about that incident, the chase, how the actual crash happened, what kind of efforts did they make to give him first aid at that point. And so we spent about $5,000 filing FOIA requests to get everything possible, all the records, all the video, all the audio, body cam footage, to try and understand what exactly happened during this incident. And we discovered many, many things. The fact that the troopers at the scene, including a supervisor, tried to cover up what happened. They tried to hide evidence. They tried to get the story straight about what had happened. And there's a video link here. I won't show it now. It's about an 8-minute video, but it's a time-coded look at what actually happened during this incident. And there are just some really, if you want to understand the anger that we're seeing out there in the streets now, this is the kind of video you should watch. It's the interaction between the cops as they're all kind of standing around like this is just an ordinary everyday incident. There's discussion about whether this person is worth rushing to the hospital with police sirens, with a police escort, and cops saying, well, no, if there was a cop laying there, yeah, we'd do that, but this is just some piece of trash. Yeah. It's basically what one of them's saying, and it's all on video. It's very compelling. You really can't watch it without getting angry. There's this story is one I actually want to show later if we have some time. It's only about 4 minutes. We can fast forward through some of it. But this is again Michigan State Police pulling. They're trying to make what would be a legitimate arrest of a drunken driver, but this man just happens to be handicapped. He's disabled. He walks with a cane. This moment captured in still at the top of the screen is the officers grabbing his cane from the car, violently pulling him out of the vehicle, and then slamming him face first into the concrete. It's so loud, the mic in the squad car picks up the sound of him hitting the pavement, and again they slam him face first into the hood of their squad car. It's incredibly disturbing.
And what strikes us is that this is a case where kind of classic investigative technique, FOIA requests of getting the documents, also Absolutely. Is creating a vivid, human, relatable, and disturbing image that really grabs people.
Absolutely.
So, you and I were talking, and it occurred, I think, to both of us that over the course of our scarily long time in this business, policing has changed a lot. What do you think are some of the key areas that journalism has not looked at systematically enough when it comes to police misconduct, when it comes to race and other difference issues? What can we be documenting that we aren't doing enough of?
Yeah, I don't think we've done enough. Some organizations have. I think Washington Post, just to single out one, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, another, that's done a good job of sort of trying to figure out, well, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where police misconduct is so rampant? It's not just a matter of, well, everyone has a cell phone now, so we're just capturing it more often than we used to. That's part of an explanation about sort of why we're seeing more of it. But I think we really need to go back and sort of figure out whether we really understand what has motivated and what has enabled this kind of interactions with police. And I think it really goes back to sort of the era after Rodney King,
Which
during
is
the time
1994, we should say, for those who
who
were
weren't born
not
yet.
yet born.
Absolutely, yes. That was also during the time of police departments really ramping up as part of the war on drugs. They really wanted heavier grade weapons, vehicles, body armor. So this whole idea of militarizing the police, which doesn't just which includes more than equipment. It's actually different training tactics, more aggressive sort of a more aggressive stance toward really imposing their will on communities. And so I think what you're seeing, or what you've seen in the last couple of weeks, is particularly many of the larger police departments really using these tactics and this equipment to really try and control populations in areas of their cities. And we see that with the constant helicopter flyovers, with trying to use vehicles to push people into areas where they wanted them to go. And I think along with that ultra aggressive stance of, well, the most important thing for you to do is go home at the end of your shift. That's that should be first and foremost in your mind, which is just a dramatic change in what I think policing used to be much more broadly, which was literally protect and serve. That officers would put their lives ahead of they would sacrifice their own lives to protect citizens at all costs. And I'm not saying they're not police. Probably the vast majority of police still not just want to do that, but actually do that. But the aggressive, we're going to shoot first and ask questions later. We're going to use these these really aggressive tactics to basically sweep people out of the way. That's the kind of thing that I think is much more common now, that we see these different kinds of police tactics. There was a story that came out over the weekend that literally showed a training seminar where the training officer was basically saying, if you're a cop, you have to view yourself as a predator. You have to be not just willing to kill, but you have to be, I'm sure lots of people saw that. That's not an atypical scenario, and that's a common training message.
And I think along with those attitudes and training messages, there's been a change where police are being held accountable for specific metrics growing out of the broken windows theories of policing, CompStat and all this, where you're being rewarded for low-level arrests, rewarded for low-level stop and frisk, things that have changed the nature of encounters.
And let's not forget the profit motive. In a lot of communities, the police department is one of the major sources of revenue.
Yeah.
That was true in Ferguson. It was true a community here in Michigan, where the police department generated something like 30 or 40% of the revenue in a town.
So through property seizures and so on. Yeah.
And even just things like traffic tickets and other kinds of fines.
Let's say I'm a local editor in New Haven, Connecticut, where I'm sitting talking from today, or in San Diego or Wyoming, or for that matter, in much of the rest of the world, in Dublin or Bangalore, all of which have adopted many of these policing strategies over the course of the last 20 years. If I want to put these issues on my news agenda, what are some specific areas of inquiry that we really should be seeing a national and indeed global network of journalists beginning to dig in on at a local or regional level? What are some issues, some metrics, some very specific places to work that can capture this evolution of police violence as you're describing it?
You need to try and understand how your police department works, or how the various law enforcement agencies in your county or your circulation area actually work. So you want to understand, you want to look at where do the majority of arrests for, say, both violent and non-violent crimes occur. Look for patterns in that arrest data. That's just where you might need some help. If data analysis isn't your thing, You may have to raise your hand and ask for help with that kind of thing. And there are journalism organizations that can help you do that, like NITAR, for example. But request the data and try and get an understanding of where exactly crimes occur, what kind of charges come from those kinds of arrests or those incidents. If you're seeing a large number of arrests, but very few actual charges, or most serious charges get dismissed, that's probably a clue that this police activity, these kinds of arrests are merely a tactic to try and make the police presence known in the community and try and deter crime, but it's not all that effective. You're spending a lot of money, a lot of resources. You're churning people through the criminal justice system, which I think we've come to have an understanding, particularly recently, how much of an impact that has on communities of color, where it's very hard to get a job after you've been arrested. Mm-hmm. It has all kinds of impacts on communities. So understanding those kinds of situations is very important. Look at citizen complaints that are filed and what kinds of complaints get filed. Are they coming from a certain portion of town? Are they, by and large, people of color who are filing these kinds of complaints? And what kind of complaints are they? Are they use of force complaints? Are they other kinds of complaints of police activity, like seizing property and not being able to get it back? Property seizures is a whole other area of exploration. Again, a lot of communities, a lot of police departments generate revenue by seizing property just because they think it's drug related. So doing those kinds of data request, open records request, I think is the first kind of important step to trying to figure out what's going on in your community. Again, it's all about trying to understand what is this rage that we're seeing sort of blowing up around America. What's behind that?
And what about on this issue, developing community sources? I think one of the challenges reporters bring, even journalists of color, very often are not from the towns or cities in which they're currently working, and where the community dynamics around law enforcement can be a little baffling. As cops reporters, we mainly embed with the police or write our stories off police department press releases. What are some ways of developing community sourcing around criminal justice that can inform our reporting choices?
So I hate to keep talking about Detroit, but in Detroit, we try to do some very unique things in terms of trying to better understand the community. And so we started doing some community listening sessions where we just went out and talked to people in the community. We didn't make people come to us and come to the Free Press and sit down and talk to us about issues. We went out into the community and basically held sort of town hall meetings, but small scale. So we had a comfortable enough environment where people, felt free to actually have honest, candid conversations. Mm-hmm. And they weren't sessions, what's the Free Press, not doing properly and you want us to look at? It wasn't. I mean, there was some of that, but they weren't those kinds of discussions where it was centered around how well are we doing covering the community. It was more, what are the important issues in your community? What impacts your everyday life? What could we do a better job of explaining is unique about life in this particular part of town? So it was more really making it clear. Look, we have a genuine interest in figuring out the you always say you don't know what you don't know, and that's very true in journalism. It's hard to know what stories you're missing if you're not out there actually talking to people and interacting with people.
So really assertively, in an organized way, inviting the community into your process. I'm going to ask you one other thing, and then we'll go to the chat where some questions are beginning to flow in. And so I would say to everyone, begin throwing them in now, and we'll consolidate, filter, and get to as many as we can. You've managed, both in your current gig at Type Investigations and in your previous gig at the Free Press, you manage multiply diverse, cross-cultural news teams. On this issue of race and criminal justice, when you've got a diverse team working on projects, how do you manage and how do you think about difference and identity on your teams? Is it neutral? Do you lean into it? There's a lot of discussion going on in journalism this week about how black and white reporters relate to one another, may see the world differently, how we get these, how we inform our news agenda in a more thoughtful way. But when it's down to the question of a team, how have you thought about that and experienced that question of difference and the question of identity?
To be honest, this is one of the things that really attracted me to type investigations. The whole mission of type is to bring diverse voices into investigative reporting, or more diverse voices into investigative reporting, in the pursuit of a wide variety of investigations. And so we have an actual fellowship that's really designed to bring in reporters who have not had the opportunity to do investigations. And this is one of the topics we talk about at IRE all the time, that IRE over the years has gotten—
That's investigative reporters and editors, for folks who don't know it.
I'm sorry, yes. So that organization has gotten much more diverse than it used to be. It used to be, I would go to IRE conferences 25 years ago, and I could wave at the other black journalist in the room.
Yeah.
You know, we were that easy to spot. But so, you know, membership has dramatically increased for journalists of color. They're taking advantage of the training, but they're going back to newsrooms and not being allowed to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that type really provides is an opportunity for journalists to work on stories that newsrooms they've been in haven't allowed them to do. We surround them with resources. Yeah. And so that's a very important thing in this industry, getting people who don't normally get the opportunity to do this kind of work, get them the support, get them resources to do this kind of journalism.
Right.
And what I tried to do throughout my career is sort of look for those kinds of people, regardless of race.
Yeah, and then you get them on a team, and they're like, I was looking at the bylines on that police accountability story that you had up a few minutes ago, and just hazarding a guess based on surnames, I thought it's probably it was a diverse team of 3 people. How do you take advantage of that diversity on a team as projects evolve? How do we lean into it?
Well, in Detroit, you know, we had a diverse team of reporters, as you were suggesting. I always had my investigative team, which was fairly large, always brainstorm and talk about ideas as a group. They were working on different projects, but I always wanted them talking about their stories as a group to sort of take advantage of the expertise, the background, the sourcing that different reporters had. Mm-hmm. I didn't really assign or push reporters into covering stories because of race. We had this bizarre story in Detroit where we had a couple of funeral homes where bodies had been stacked up and hidden, and a really macabre, you know, horrible story. It made national news. And so again, in trying to understand how this could possibly happen in a large, you know, metropolitan area like Detroit, we assigned 3 or 4 people to a team and had them, you know, basically do the background of this funeral home, which at one point had been this showpiece black business in the heart of Detroit. And we wanted to chronicle how it had deteriorated over the years and became basically this horror, you know, this house of horrors. That team just happened to be all white reporters, but I had every confidence that they knew the city, they knew the kind of sourcing that they needed to get, and they wouldn't have problems going out into the community and doing the kind of reporting that needed to be done for this story. And sure enough, they executed the story perfectly, because they had this mindset of, they had always had this mindset that, hey, you know, Detroit is my home, it's my city. Yeah. I know sources out there in the community, regardless of color. And I think that's exactly what you want to aim for. You want to have people that them just get in their car, drive as rapidly through the city as possible, and then get out of the car and walk into the newspaper. Yeah. The community is where they live, it's where they interact. they know, bars and all kinds of communities where, you can go and just hang out with people and absorb story tips and that sort of thing. It's when you parachute into your city or into your neighborhoods for, this story or that story, that's where you have the disconnection in a lot of communities.
Yeah.
It's like anything else. You really have to be out there talking to people of all kinds, of all
So,
sorts.
so really it's about talking. On the one hand, it's about
It is.
talking
There's no
as a
shortcut.
team, about projects. So you're getting everyone's perspective, projects, priorities, perspectives, and talking to the community in a patient way. Let's go to the chat because there's some cool questions. And again, people can start pouring them in. Alyssa asks, so much about the criminal justice system is localized in this country, certainly. Do you think that the contraction of local news has worsened coverage? Do you think that lack of local news has led to a lack of good coverage of criminal justice issues? And with layoffs and the contraction of local news seemingly accelerating, how are we going to do this kind of time-consuming investigative work that seems to be rooted at the community level?
That's absolutely true. Um, um, a lot of communities, don't have full-time police reporters. That was true in Detroit. We didn't actually have a full-time police reporter. Um, but again, it's newsrooms have to make tough decisions these days, and deciding what it is you cover, what you devote to, whether you call it accountability reporting or investigative reporting, watchdog, whatever name you want to give it. It's doing this sort of time-consuming story work that is really going to separate you and distinguish your newsroom from all the other content that's out there. And basically what I tried to do in Detroit was make it very clear. I had both an investigative team and a team of other beat reporters. And what I told, example, we had two reporters covering sort of Detroit city government. And I told them, look, all that routine stuff that we would normally cover, just forget about that. We're going to focus on this investigation of the mayor of Detroit. And that's all we're going to work on, except, something major happens, like the mayor decides to resign.
So essentially one of the things you're saying is, look, even in a time of constricted resources, if it's up to editors to exert some leadership and say this is important enough to our community, and if that's the case, because your paper has for a long time, your former paper was under tremendous economic pressure. I mean, the Free Press is a paper that at various times came close to the edge and then kept going, but I'm sure that getting the resources required constant fighting. Joe Bowen has a really interesting question that both is about his own story and that asks more broadly, I think, a question that a lot of newsrooms are struggling with in different ways. A colleague in the seminar, he says, and I work in a deeply red state and cover a city where a police officer was recently killed in a shootout. We want to pursue a few different stories about the police department here, but our bosses are concerned about giving the impression that our paper is disrespecting the dead officer's memory, or otherwise, going along those lines. How would you navigate that if you were trying to sort that one out in an environment where there is sometimes violence against police? Police are killed. People do have strong feelings about criminal justice enforcement, as well as about the stuff we've been talking about. How do you navigate those issues?
I've actually lived this experience. So, yeah, it's tough. I mean, again, you have to approach it from a source building, very human kind of approach. You really have to convince, when you first reach out and try and make contact with this story, you have to make it clear, the first thing I want to do is I want to listen. I want to hear about, this officer and his time on the force and the kind of work that he had done. I want to understand, sort of what this officer walked into or came upon, or however he got involved in the situation. I want to learn about, how many kinds of situations, he had faced before. You want to make it clear to sources that, you're not out to do a gotcha story. It's not about this particular person necessarily. You're trying to learn more about the department and how it handles these kinds of scenarios.
Yeah.
Build some trust. Make it clear that the kind of story you're going after is not something sensationalistic or an effort to make this person look bad. You're trying to understand how these kinds of incidents occur.
Yeah. I also think that in my experience anyway, editors sometimes have a insufficiently complex view of police department politics themselves. I think in many departments, and we're seeing this play out over this week, there are important political divides and arguments going on. And if a newsroom, on the one hand, invests in deeply respectful reporting of the death of an officer in the line of duty, that doesn't mean you can't be pursuing the other challenging stories. In fact, your respectful reporting on the death of an officer in the line of duty may earn the kind of trust that it will allow officers or others to say to you, yeah, there are some real issues. We want our department to be better. We want our department to live up to the memory of the dead officer. So, I think understanding that police departments have political divides that in your sourcing you can build up trust and play into is also probably pretty important. Yeah.
I once had a publisher at a newspaper who was much more concerned about the death of a police dog than of any officer who had fallen in the line of duty. Sometimes you just have to have sort of candid conversations with the leadership of your newsroom, whether you're a reporter or an editor. It's obviously most helpful if both reporter and editor can be in on these conversations, so that everyone has a complete understanding of this is where we're coming from the people who are out there on the streets trying to chronicle these stories to their editors and managers. But make it clear that if we really want to serve our readers, these are the kinds of issues we need to go after. It may not be incredibly popular, but if public service is something we really believe in and as part of our mission, these are the kind of stories we have to pursue.
And I also think that at the community level, when it comes to issues like policing, what we've seen over this week is the reality that public attitudes are complicated and always in motion. We have certainly seen lots of outrage in the US at the community level in red states and in profoundly white and Republican areas, Wyoming, South Dakota. These are not places you would have thought would be the hotbed of Black Lives Matter protest or of support for accountability, yet there's both a generational difference, but also a genuine sense of outrage that can be engaged. And I think sometimes local newsrooms forget the complexity of their own readers. Sandhya asks, do you think America's gun laws have made the police more aggressive? Like, again, feeding your question about how do you go home safely at the end of the day, how do gun laws and gun availability play into the feeling of safety or threat that officers have, and how do we report on that?
Well, just look at some of the horrific scenes we've seen over the last few years. Vegas, where the guy brought in suitcases full of weapons over the course of a couple of days. Boston, where the Boston Marathon bombers had both bombs and guns. That's made a sort of understandable reaction in police departments. We had to be prepared for anything and everything. We need this kind of heavy equipment. We need to have military tactics in order to confront all kinds of scenarios with involving weapons. It's not hard to understand why cops would want to have that kind of firepower. It's just it's a question of measuring police response versus the actual realistic threat level that's out there. But yeah, I mean, gun control, obviously some states, red or blue, have gun cultures where I've seen videos where we've in my last newspaper we profiled a family where every single member of the family had a weapon, from the adults to children as young as 3 and 4. Mm-hmm. They had their own granted small weapons, and they all went out hunting, and they just believed that gun ownership was what every family should believe in. Uh, you know, we're never, we're probably never going to have the kind of gun control that some people want, but the kind of easy access to, military-style weapons is something that will probably be addressed with all this police reform measures we're talking about.
And I also do think that there's, again, opportunities to gain trust with officers who are frightened about the large number of guns out in neighborhoods when they're on the beat. They're one of the strange disconnects in American politics around law enforcement is that we love to give lots of military weaponry to officers because they're afraid, but we don't listen to law enforcement leaders around guns and who say guns are a huge part of the problem and here's what we got to do. So I think there are some opportunities there to complicate the picture. And I think that's, in a way, what we've seen this week. That's a big challenge for local newsrooms especially, is a complication of the picture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And these are hard. Any question that deals with race and income inequality and sort of institutional racism, and these are always difficult, hard questions. It's filled with emotion. People who come to it with different backgrounds and different things at stake, and it's a lot of times, when we're writing about police misconduct stories, oftentimes the victims of misconduct,
Yeah.
aren't coming to these stories with clean hands. They have come to the attention of police for some reason or another. Not always, but and those are sometimes very difficult stories to tell because people want to sympathize with, a victim, and that isn't always the case, and that isn't always easy. So yeah, they can be very complicated stories to tell. I think what we saw with George Floyd was, whether that was a counterfeit $20 bill or not, it certainly wasn't something someone deserved to die for. And what made that story so impactful, I think, was in fact the video where it's very clear the guy's under control. He is pleading, for his life. And I think that is what made that video so impactful and why it sparked outrage over the world. It was just a clear-cut case of this is cold, callous murder. I think without all those elements, I don't know if the story would have had the impact and the power that it's had. People they could look at that, and it was just sort of a humanitarian outrage that the guy is being basically choked to death with from a guy who has his hands in his pockets and is like he's out for a Sunday stroll.
I'm going to ask you one other thing, and then I think there's a bit of video you want to show. If there are folks on this seminar who are local journalists or are freelancers pitching editors or in nonprofit newsrooms, and they're trying to persuade a reluctant editor to throw some resources around a police accountability story, around developing some consistent coverage at the intersection of race and policing that's not just a one-off, what's the best argument they can make to get an editor's attention right now and to say, it may not be what we've done before, but it may not be what we've done, but we want to do it. What's the argument you're going to make?
That these are stories that get at the core issues of quality of life. That if large segments of our community, of our readership, have this almost adversarial relationship with police, where they feel like they're in an occupied territory in their own neighborhoods, that's a story that we have to tell. We have to make people understand on both sides, what's at stake here. Are we, a year or two away from having a blow up like we've seen with George Floyd? Are we really, again, serving our readers well, trying to understand issues that really impact their life in a very significant way? I think that's the best argument you can make.
Yeah, I'd said I was gonna ask you one more, but Sarah Betancourt has thrown a really rich question into the hopper that I've really got to ask you. As through journalism, how do we convince people on both sides of policing reform to come together to debate? It's so polarized. she says, I've been working on this for my local newsroom and host a podcast where we discuss public policy issues in Massachusetts. Police chiefs don't always want to engage. Activists may not want to come on the show. How do we persuade law enforcement in particular that openly engaging through either broadcast or podcast or print journalism right now is something that's worth doing?
I think you have to really show, it's an adage in editing circles, you need to show, not tell.
Yeah.
So I think we need to do this kind of accountability reporting to lay out the problems. That's the first step. Document exactly what's wrong, what isn't working well, what is an actual betrayal of public trust in your community. Put those facts on the table, and then lay out, what are possible solutions? What are ways that the community can actually tackle this issue? I think that's the only way you bring both sides to the table. Look, here's what we know is wrong. There's different ways we can fix this. What solutions make sense for our community? And try and encourage that conversation.
So let's show just a couple of minutes of this video. Set us up. What are we seeing, and what should we be thinking about as we look at it as journalists?
Right. So again, this was an early morning incident where state police pulled over this, I think he's 41-year-old Detroit man. He's clearly intoxicated, but he's disabled. He can't walk without a cane, and it shows how the troopers deal with him very, very harshly, very violently. And this gets to the point of why African Americans in particular feel so much outrage, so much anger about the way people are treated. And bear in mind, I believe this was in 2017.
And should we show this from the beginning or a little bit in?
I would show it from the beginning, and we could probably stop after, say, a minute.
Great. Go for it.
What happens during a traffic stop in Royal Oak doesn't sit well with supervisors. Michigan State Police pull over a 41-year-old Detroit man driving drunk on 696. It happened in December 2017, just after 2 a.m. Troopers stand near his SUV. One is on the driver's side for about 3 minutes. You can't hear what is said, but here's what happens next. Jason Spicer sticks his bare hands out of the car. You can see Trooper Mark Carroll yank a cane from the SUV. He pulls Spicer from the vehicle and slams him into the ground. The microphone on Trooper Carroll is not working, but the sound of Spicer smacking the pavement is loud enough that a microphone inside the patrol car records it. Take a look at what happened again.
All right, let's pause that there.
So the reason this video is significant is not just the sort of horrific nature of what they did to this guy. This was so obviously against procedure and unnecessary that Internal Affairs flagged this case and investigated it and recommended that this case be forwarded to prosecutors for charges against the trooper involved. That top investigator just happened to be black. And so there was apparently enough complaints from troopers in the department that investigation got squashed. Or that recommendation for charges got squashed. And this top person in Internal Affairs ultimately decided she couldn't work in the department anymore, that she encountered discrimination and sort of arbitrary decisions against her so often she just quit the force. She ended up filing a whistleblower lawsuit, and we ended up doing a story about that. That here's your top person in charge of internal affairs, and even she encounters discrimination in Michigan State Police. They filed the lawsuit, and after, I'm not saying our story caused this, but after our story ran, the department settled with her for $2 million.
What struck me in that was how in this video was that you took something that in our age of social media, a bit of video might have gone viral by itself without an act of journalism being committed, but you applied real journalism craft to it, and instead of just letting it hang out there, you set it up, you told people what they were going to see, you slowed the video down so they could see it, you made the editorial decision to show it twice, saying, okay, here's what it looks like, now let's go back and look again and see what happened. You really committed an act of journalism rather than just an act of viral video. And I think that is an excellent example of how what we do as journalists is profoundly relevant at this moment.
Absolutely. The video goes on toward the end to show, the story that they filed in their report and the story they told fellow troopers when they booked this guy at the jail was that, oh, this guy came after us with his cane. And so I bravely disarmed him. And then we took him down with, a very specific, armbar maneuver. And you see in the video exactly what they did. This guy can't walk. They show him later trying to walk without his cane, and you can hear him screaming in agony because he had a very old leg injury.
Yeah.
So it's important to do that kind of narrative explanation about, well, here's what you're seeing, here's why we're telling you about it. Here's exactly key moments in the video you should look at.
And we've shared the link to the full video in the chat. We are going to have to stop here. We've run out of time, but Mark, thank you for guiding us through this fraught landscape, and I think reinvigorating all of our imaginations and our toolkits as journalists as we go forward from this exceptional moment in the national and global debate about race and criminal justice. I want to thank a couple of other people, Susan Kaplan, who is assembling the running tip sheet, my colleagues Kate Black and Ariel Richen, who are driving the car behind the scenes. This ongoing series of conversations for journalists is going to continue, so watch our YouTube channel or Facebook page, Twitter feed, web page, all of the above for further events in this series. Thank all of you for being on here, for bringing your insights, your questions, and for carrying the work forward. Thanks
for having
everyone.
me.